My wife asked for a divorce. She looked me dead in the eye and said she wanted the house, the luxury cars, and the entire company, but she absolutely did not want our paralyzed son. My lawyer begged me to fight her. Instead, I looked at her, picked up a pen, and signed every single asset over to her name. Everyone in that courtroom thought I had lost my mind. I gave her an empire worth $12 million without a single argument. At the final hearing, she smiled a triumphant, venomous smile, thinking she had ruined me. She had no idea I had already won. Her smile vanished the second her lawyer leaned over and whispered 5 little words. "You just assumed the debt." Before I tell you how a man loses his entire fortune on purpose just to watch his greedy wife drown in it, let me know where you are listening from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you believe that sometimes the best revenge is simply giving a toxic person exactly what they ask for. My name is Russell. I am 63 years old, and I spent the last 3 decades building a commercial real estate holding company from the ground up. I thought I was building a legacy for my family. Instead, I built a trap for my wife. It started on a Tuesday evening. I was standing in the kitchen of our custom-built estate, wiping down the granite countertops. The house was quiet, too quiet since the accident. The heavy mahogany front door swung open, and Cynthia walked in. She did not take off her designer coat. She did not ask how my day was. She walked straight into the kitchen and tossed a thick, heavy manila envelope onto the center island. It landed with a heavy thud, sliding across the polished stone until it hit the edge of the sink. I put down the sponge and looked at her. She stood with her arms crossed, her jaw set in that familiar line of absolute entitlement. "Divorce papers," she said, her voice completely devoid of emotion. "I want you out by the end of the week." I wiped my hands on a towel and picked up the envelope. I pulled out the stack of legal documents. They were warm from sitting in her car. I started reading the first page. She did not sit down. She paced the length of the kitchen, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She began listing her demands aloud, as if reading from a script she had rehearsed for months. She demanded the primary estate, the property we were standing in, fully paid off and clear of any liens. She demanded the 3 luxury vehicles currently sitting in the temperature-controlled garage. But most importantly, she demanded total, uncontested ownership of Vanguard Properties, the commercial real estate firm I had shed blood and sweat to build over 30 years. She wanted 100% of the voting shares and complete control over the corporate accounts. I turned to the second page of the settlement. There was a glaring omission. I looked up at her and asked about Aaron. Aaron is our 28-year-old son. 6 months ago, a drunk driver ran a red light and crushed the driver's side of his sedan. He suffered a severe spinal cord injury. He was currently living in a cramped, inaccessible apartment while I finalized the permits to retrofit our guest house for his wheelchair. The medical bills were astronomical, but Vanguard Properties generated more than enough revenue to cover his specialized physical therapy and the necessary home modifications. Cynthia stopped pacing. She looked at me with a coldness that chilled the room. She stated explicitly that she was completely cutting Aaron off. She crossed her arms tighter and declared that Aaron was a grown man who needed to figure out his own life. She refused to let what she called her assets be drained by endless medical debt and pointless renovations for a paralyzed boy. She actually used the word pointless. She looked at the father of her child and said she would not sacrifice her lifestyle, her international vacations, or her corporate standing to play nursemaid for the rest of her life. The settlement in my hands legally severed all financial responsibility toward him, leaving the burden entirely on my shoulders. She expected me to explode. She braced herself for a screaming match. She wanted me to throw the papers in her face, to yell about my 30 years of hard work, to scream about her absolute lack of maternal instinct. She thrived on that kind of dramatic conflict. It validated her victim complex. She waited for the rage. I gave her nothing. I felt my heartbeat slow down. The sheer audacity of her greed crystallized my mind. I looked at the clauses detailing the immediate transfer of Vanguard Properties into her sole possession. I saw the specific legal jargon indemnifying her from my past actions, isolating the company entirely under her name. She wanted it all. She wanted the power, the prestige, and the cash flow without a single ounce of the responsibility. I reached into the breast pocket of my flannel shirt and pulled out my silver pen. I did not argue. I did not mention the late nights I spent sleeping on the floor of my first office to get the company off the ground. I did not mention the nights I held Erin's hand in the intensive care unit while she was at a spa retreat processing her trauma. I simply flipped to the very last page of the preliminary agreement. Cynthia took a step forward, her eyes widening in confusion. "What are you doing?" she snapped. "Read the terms, Russell. You have 30 days to contest. I know you are going to drag this out, so just get your lawyer on the phone." I clicked the pen. I pressed the tip to the signature line. I signed my full legal name in dark blue ink. I flipped to the asset forfeiture addendum and signed that as well. I initialed every single page acknowledging that I was giving up my rights to the estate, the cars, and the entire corporate entity of Vanguard Properties. I surrendered $12 million in hard assets in less than 40 seconds. I capped the pen and slid the thick stack of papers back across the granite island toward her. "Done," I said quietly. Cynthia stared at the documents, completely paralyzed. This was not how she had envisioned the evening. She had prepared for a brutal legal war. She had hired the most vicious divorce attorney in the city, anticipating months of discovery depositions and bitter negotiations. She expected me to beg for a share of the company, to plead for the house, or at least fight for Erin's medical trust. Instead, I had just handed her the keys to the kingdom without firing a single shot. She reached out tentatively and pulled the papers toward her, her eyes scanning my fresh signatures. A flash of profound disappointment crossed her face. She was furious that I did not fight for her, that I did not view her as a prize worth battling over. But that disappointment quickly morphed into a smug, victorious sneer. She gathered the papers and stuffed them back into the manila envelope. "You always were weak, Russell," she spat, her tone dripping with contempt. "You fold the second things, get difficult. Just like you did with Erin. I will have my attorney file these first thing in the morning. Have your bags packed by Friday." She turned on her heel and marched out of the kitchen. I listened to her footsteps echo down the grand hallway, followed by the heavy slam of the front door. The house was dead silent once again. I stood alone in the kitchen, looking at the empty granite counter. I did not feel weak. I felt the precise, cold calculation of a man who had just set a steel trap. Cynthia thought she had just robbed me blind. She thought she had stripped me of my life's work and abandoned our crippled son to rot in poverty. She did not realize that by demanding total indemnified ownership of Vanguard Properties, she had just legally chained herself to a sinking ship. She did not know what was buried in the municipal zoning database. She did not know what the city inspectors were going to find underneath the concrete of the Avalon complex by the end of the week. I picked up my phone and dialed my attorney. The phone rang twice before Warren answered, his voice thick with sleep. I told him Cynthia had presented the papers. I told him I signed them all. Warren gasped audibly through the receiver. He started stammering, telling me I had made a catastrophic mistake, that signing a preliminary agreement without his review was legal suicide. I cut him off mid-sentence. I instructed him to receive the documents from her attorney in the morning and to fast-track the finalization process. I told him to waive the standard cooling-off period. I wanted the transfer of Vanguard Properties executed and registered with the State Commerce Department immediately. Warren asked me if I was having a breakdown. He reminded me that without the company revenue, I had no way to pay for Erin's next surgery. I walked out of the kitchen and into my private study. I looked at the framed architectural blueprints hanging on the wall. I told Warren to do exactly as I instructed and to prepare the secondary file I had given him last month. I hung up the phone before he could argue further. I did not need to explain my sanity to him. The results would speak for themselves. I pulled a canvas duffel bag from the closet and began packing exactly what I needed. 5 shirts, 3 pairs of jeans, my work boots, and the encrypted hard drive containing the true value of my legacy. The house was no longer mine, but I was leaving nothing of value behind. The morning sun glared through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my attorney's office downtown. Warren was pacing relentlessly behind his massive oak desk. He was a senior partner at the firm and a man who charged $800 an hour to dismantle marriages with surgical precision. Right now, he was sweating through his tailored shirt. He held the preliminary agreement Cynthia had presented to me the night before. His hands were visibly shaking as he dropped the thick stack of papers onto his desk. He leaned forward, planting his palms flat on the polished wood, and stared at me as if I had lost my mind. He asked me if I was under the influence of narcotics when I signed the documents. I sat perfectly still in the leather guest chair. I told him I was completely sober and fully aware of my actions. Warren ran a hand over his face and began pacing again. He pointed a trembling finger at my signature on the final page. He begged me to let him file an injunction. He pleaded with me to claim duress, stating that a judge would throw out this ridiculous agreement in a heartbeat if we argued she caught me off guard in my own home. I shook my head once. I told him I did not want the agreement thrown out. I wanted it ratified immediately. Warren stopped pacing and grabbed a yellow legal pad. He started reading the numbers aloud, and his voice rose in panic with every figure. He calculated that I was voluntarily handing over $12 million in hard assets without a single word of protest. He listed the primary estate, noting its current market value and the fact that it was entirely paid off with no mortgage. He listed the 3 luxury vehicles sitting in the garage. Then he slammed his hand down on the page, detailing Vanguard properties. He said I was giving away a commercial real estate empire that I had spent my entire adult life building from scratch. He told me that Cynthia was attempting the most brazen corporate theft he had seen in his 30-year career as a lawyer. He begged me to fight her. He said we could tie her up in civil litigation for a decade. We could drain the corporate accounts with legal fees until she begged for a reasonable settlement. He promised me he could protect at least 60% of the holding company and secure a massive alimony payout for me since she was the one demanding the divorce and abandoning a disabled child. I listened to his frantic pitch without changing my expression. I let him run entirely out of breath. When the room finally went quiet, I leaned forward and told him I did not want a single dime of alimony. I did not want a 50-50 split. I wanted absolute and total forfeiture of Vanguard properties to my soon-to-be ex-wife. Warren dropped his pen. It rolled off the desk and hit the thick carpet. He sank heavily into his executive chair and wiped beads of sweat from his forehead. He asked me if I truly understood the current financial composition of my own company. He reminded me that Vanguard Properties was not just a collection of safe and paid-off strip malls anymore. He brought up the crown jewel of our portfolio, the Avalon Complex. It was a massive downtown commercial build. It was a sprawling development of retail space and luxury condominiums that had consumed our entire corporate focus for the last 3 years. Warren pulled up the corporate file on his computer monitor and read back the loan structures to me. He reminded me that Vanguard Properties was highly leveraged to fund the Avalon project. We had taken out massive municipal loans and borrowed against our existing properties to finance the endless construction costs. The debt-to-income ratio was absolutely staggering. The entire company was a delicate house of cards, balancing solely on the successful completion and city inspection of that single downtown complex. Warren warned me that whoever held the voting shares of Vanguard Properties held the keys to a financial powder keg. If anything delayed the opening of the Avalon complex, the municipal creditors would tear the company apart and liquidate everything. He looked me in the eye and said I was handing Cynthia a $12 million loaded weapon. I kept my gaze locked directly on his. I told him that was exactly the point. I ordered Warren to finalize the paperwork exactly as Cynthia had drafted it. I explicitly instructed him to ensure the indemnification clauses were absolutely watertight. I wanted no legal loopholes that could ever connect me to Vanguard Properties once the judge's gavel fell. I wanted Cynthia listed as the sole proprietor and the only voting shareholder. I wanted her named as the absolute guarantor of all corporate debts moving forward. Warren swallowed hard. He looked at the paperwork again and finally started to see the sharp edges of the trap I had built. The panic in his eyes shifted into a deep and cautious confusion. He warned me that if the Avalon complex succeeded, Cynthia would walk away a billionaire, and I would have nothing. I told him I was perfectly comfortable with that risk. I told him to draft the final decree today. I wanted no delays and no extensions. I told him to concede to every single demand her attorney made. If they asked for the antique furniture, give it to them. If they asked for the art collection, give it to them. Just make sure the corporate transfer was absolute and immediate. Warren slowly gathered the papers and placed them inside a fresh manila folder. He looked entirely exhausted. He asked me a very simple question. He asked how I planned to survive. He pointed out that by giving Cynthia the company and the house and the bank accounts, I was effectively making myself homeless and destitute. He reminded me of Aaron. He asked how I was going to pay for my paralyzed son's physical therapy and the specialized spinal surgeries he still desperately needed. He told me pride was not going to pay the medical bills, and Aaron deserved better than to live in poverty. I reached into my canvas duffel bag resting on the floor beside my chair. I pulled out a separate and sealed leather folder. I placed it gently on Warren's desk. I told him to open it. He broke the seal and flipped through the thick stack of documents inside. His eyes widened as he read the official headers. They were intellectual property patents. Specifically, they were the exclusive engineering patents for the thermal sensors and structural dampeners currently being installed in every single new commercial building in the state, including the Avalon complex. Warren looked up at me, completely stunned. I explained that I had quietly transferred the absolute ownership of those patents entirely into Aaron's name over a year ago, long before Cynthia ever mentioned the word divorce. Vanguard Properties did not own the technology it relied on. My son did. And every time a contractor used those patents, Aaron received a massive royalty payment directly into an untouchable trust fund. I stood up from the leather chair and buttoned my jacket. I looked down at my attorney and told him to process the divorce. I zipped the heavy canvas duffel bag shut. It sat on the edge of the custom king-sized bed in the master suite. I had designed this room myself over a decade ago, focusing on natural light and open space. Now it just felt like a hollow cavern. I did not open the massive walk-in closets. I left behind the rows of expensive tailored suits, the imported Italian leather shoes, and the collection of vintage watches I had accumulated over the years. None of those things mattered anymore. They were just heavy anchors tying me to a life that had turned incredibly toxic. The bag I held contained 5 simple work shirts, 3 pairs of durable jeans, a pair of steel-toed boots, and the encrypted laptop that held the true operational blueprints of my life. I slung the strap over my shoulder and walked out of the bedroom. The thick oak floorboards creaked softly under my weight as I moved down the long corridor toward the grand foyer. Cynthia was waiting for me at the bottom of the sweeping staircase. She leaned casually against the edge of an antique marble console table holding a crystal glass filled with expensive red wine. She wore a dark silk robe and her hair was perfectly styled. She had positioned herself there intentionally to oversee my exit. She wanted to savor her perceived victory. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine as I approached the heavy front door. A smug, self-satisfied smile spread across her face. She let out a soft, mocking laugh that echoed in the quiet foyer. She told me it was genuinely pathetic to watch a grown man tuck his tail between his legs and run away from his own home so easily. She said she always knew I was weak, but she never expected me to surrender without shedding a single tear. She stood there sipping her wine and claimed my silence was proof of my cowardice. She said I was handing over a $12 million real estate empire because I lacked the basic spine required to defend my own legacy. She insulted my manhood, my business acumen, and my self-respect. I stopped with my hand hovering over the cold brass doorknob. I did not turn around to face her. I did not raise my voice to defend my honor. I did not remind her that my spine was the only reason she had been able to live a life of absolute luxury for 30 years. I simply told her to enjoy the house. I turned the knob, pulled the heavy door open, and stepped out into the crisp evening air. The door clicked shut behind me with a solid final thud. It was the sound of 3 decades of marriage and history being completely severed. I walked down the sweeping brick driveway. I walked right past the 3 luxury European sedans parked near the garage. They were sleek, polished, and legally hers now. I walked past the manicured rose bushes and out onto the street where my 10-year-old pickup truck was parked under a streetlight. It was scratched, dented, and perfectly reliable. It was also the only vehicle registered exclusively in my name, making it untouchable in the corporate handover. I tossed my duffel bag onto the passenger seat, climbed behind the steering wheel, and turned the ignition. The drive across the city took 45 minutes. I watched the scenery change through the cracked windshield. The sprawling gated communities and pristine sidewalks of the affluent suburbs slowly gave way to the dense, flickering streetlights of the industrial district. The roads became uneven and potholed. The buildings grew taller and much more weathered. This was the part of town Vanguard Properties usually bought up to demolish and gentrify. Now it was the only place my disabled son could afford to live. I pulled the truck into the cramped, poorly lit parking lot of a brutalist concrete apartment building. The security gate was permanently broken and stuck open. I grabbed my bag and walked into the dingy lobby. The passenger elevator had an out-of-order sign taped to the doors, so I walked down a long corridor smelling of stale smoke and bleach to use the rattling freight elevator. I took it up to the 4th floor. I walked down a narrow hallway and stopped in front of a heavy metal door. Apartment 412. I knocked twice. A few moments later, I heard the distinct mechanical hum of a motorized wheelchair rolling across cheap linoleum. The deadbolt clicked and the door swung inward. Aaron sat in the doorway. He looked exhausted. His face was pale and drawn, reflecting the sheer physical toll of his daily spinal rehabilitation. He looked at my duffel bag and then looked up at my face. His eyes widened in realization. I stepped inside and pushed the door shut behind me. The apartment was painfully small and entirely unsuitable for a man in his condition. The hallways were barely wide enough to accommodate the wheels of his chair. The kitchen counters were too high for him to reach, and the bathroom required him to perform dangerous transfers just to use the shower. This was the miserable reality Cynthia had condemned him to when she refused to let her corporate assets be used for his medical care. I walked into the cramped living room and sat down on a cheap folding chair. I did not sugarcoat the situation. I looked directly at my son and told him exactly what had happened over the last few hours. I told him Cynthia demanded a divorce. I told him I had gone to my attorney's office and signed the preliminary agreement. I told him I had legally surrendered the primary estate, the vehicles and total ownership of Vanguard Properties, directly into her name. I watched the blood drain from Aaron's face. For a moment, he was completely silent. Then his hands gripped the hard plastic armrests of his wheelchair, so tightly his knuckles turned white. His voice shook with a sudden, explosive mixture of deep grief and pure, unadulterated rage. He accused me of rolling over and dying. He asked how I could possibly surrender everything we had built as a family. He yelled that Cynthia was a selfish monster who had just successfully destroyed our entire lives, and I had simply handed her the keys to the vault. He leaned forward, his eyes burning with angry tears. He said I had abandoned him to live in this concrete box while she sat in a mansion drinking wine. I sat perfectly still and let him vent. I let all the anger and betrayal spill out of him, because based on the surface facts, he had every right to be furious. I did not interrupt him. I did not try to comfort him with empty platitudes or tell him that everything happens for a reason. Platitudes do not pay medical bills. When he finally ran out of breath and sat back in his chair panting with exertion, I reached into my canvas bag. I pulled out my laptop and set it firmly on his small, wobbly kitchen table. I opened the screen and told him to wheel himself closer. I connected to his weak wireless network and opened a highly secure browser window. I did not log into any personal banking portals or corporate Vanguard accounts. Instead, I navigated directly to the Municipal Zoning and Geographic Information System database for the city. I bypassed the public access portal and used my developer credentials to access the restricted raw data. I typed in the specific parcel identification numbers for the Avalon complex. The screen loaded a massive complex topographic map overlaying the downtown city grid. I pointed to the large red square dominating the center of the display. I reminded Aaron that this was the Avalon project. It was the multi-million-dollar commercial development that Vanguard Properties was currently building. It was the absolute crown jewel of the company portfolio. It was also the project that Cynthia now completely owned and was entirely legally liable for. Aaron stared at the glowing screen, his breathing still heavy with residual anger. He asked me what a municipal zoning map had to do with his mother stealing my life's work. I did not answer him right away. I typed a secondary command into the database terminal, filtering the structural results by historical environmental hazards and subterranean geological surveys. A new highly classified layer of data washed over the topographic map. Directly beneath the bright red outline of the Avalon complex, a massive, jagged yellow warning zone appeared on the screen. I looked away from the laptop and met my son's eyes. I explained the harsh, hidden reality of commercial real estate. I told him Vanguard Properties did not acquire that specific plot of downtown land because it was a prime commercial location. We bought it for pennies on the dollar years ago because the city knew what was hiding underneath it. I pointed at the jagged yellow zone on the screen. I showed him the geological surveys buried deep within the restricted city archives. I showed him the severe underground water table erosion patterns and the massive undocumented industrial sinkhole that the original developers had desperately tried to conceal. I told him the ground beneath the Avalon complex was fundamentally unstable and required incredibly specific, expensive structural engineering to prevent a total collapse. I closed the laptop and told Aaron that Cynthia had no idea what she was really taking when she demanded that company. The morning of the final hearing was overcast and bitterly cold. I parked my old pickup truck in the public lot, 3 blocks away from the downtown courthouse. I walked through the heavy gray drizzle without an umbrella. I did not care about the rain. My mind was entirely focused on the precise legal machinery that was about to be set into motion. I walked through the metal detectors and took the elevator up to the 4th floor. The corridors were lined with miserable couples arguing in hushed tones with their attorneys. I felt no misery. I felt an overwhelming sense of calm. The heavy oak doors of courtroom number 4 opened with a slow creak. I walked down the center aisle. The air conditioning was turned up too high, making the massive room feel like a meat locker. I wore the same simple gray suit I wore to church on Sundays. It was nothing flashy. I took my seat at the defense table next to my lawyer, Warren. Warren looked like he had not slept in a week. He was already nervously clicking his pen, staring at the empty leather chair across the aisle. He leaned over and whispered that it was not too late to stop this madness. I ignored him and stared straight ahead at the empty bench. A few moments later, Cynthia made her grand entrance. She did not just walk into the courtroom. She paraded into it. She wore a brand new tailored white designer suit that probably cost more than my first car. Her hair was perfectly styled, and she carried a luxury handbag that she set on the plaintiff's table as if it were a royal crown. She looked absolutely radiant with greed. She did not even glance in my direction. Next to her walked her attorney, Fletcher. Fletcher was a sharp man in his early 40s, known for his aggressive litigation and ruthless courtroom tactics. He wore a custom pinstripe suit and shot me a predatory smile as he opened his expensive leather briefcase. He thought he was about to slaughter a helpless sheep. He thought I was a broken old man too tired to fight for my own wealth. He had absolutely no idea he was walking blindfolded into a slaughterhouse. The bailiff ordered everyone to rise. We all stood, as the Honorable Judge Peterson entered the room. He was an older man with silver hair and a stern, deeply lined face. He was known throughout the city for being meticulous and entirely unforgiving of legal games. He took his seat behind the high wooden bench, adjusted his reading glasses, and picked up the thick file containing our finalized divorce settlement. The courtroom was dead silent as he flipped through the heavy stack of paper. I watched his eyes scan the lines. I watched his eyebrows slowly rise toward his hairline. He read the clause transferring the primary estate free and clear of any encumbrances. He read the clause transferring the luxury vehicles. Then he reached the corporate addendum regarding Vanguard properties. He stopped reading entirely. He looked over the top of his glasses directly at Fletcher. The judge asked if this document was some kind of typographical error. Fletcher stood up, incredibly proud of himself. He confidently stated that the document was entirely accurate and reflected the mutual desires of both parties. He puffed out his chest and added that his client was graciously assuming the burden of the corporate entity to allow her ex-husband a clean break from the stress of management. Cynthia sat next to him looking like a modern-day saint offering charity to a peasant. Judge Peterson was not convinced by the performance. He turned his piercing gaze toward my table. He bypassed my attorney entirely and addressed me directly. He stated that in his 20 years on the bench, he had never seen a man voluntarily strip himself of every single financial asset without demanding a trial. He warned me that if he signed this court order, Vanguard Properties would immediately become the sole property and exclusive responsibility of my ex-wife. There would be no appeals. There would be no future claims. He looked me dead in the eye and asked me for the first time if I was signing this agreement of my own free will. I stood up tall and looked back at him. I kept my voice perfectly even. I said, "Yes, Your Honor, I am." The judge frowned deeply. He leaned forward, resting his arms on the bench, and reminded me that I was waiving my right to any future corporate profits, any severance pay, or any spousal support. He asked me for the second time if I was under any form of duress, coercion, or hidden threats from the plaintiff. I kept my voice perfectly calm and steady. I said, "No, Your Honor, I am completely aware of what I am doing, and I am under no duress whatsoever." Warren shifted uncomfortably in his chair next to me, rubbing his temples in despair. Cynthia let out a soft, condescending sigh from across the room. She rolled her eyes as if my presence and the judge's questions were simply delaying her inevitable coronation. Judge Peterson took off his glasses and placed them heavily on the desk. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and frustration. He asked me for the third and final time if I understood that this legal decree was absolute and irrevocable. I turned my head slowly and looked at Cynthia. I looked at the smug, victorious expression painted across her face. I thought about Aaron sitting in his cramped wheelchair, accessible apartment. Then I looked back at the judge. I said, "Yes, Your Honor, I understand perfectly. I want her to have it all." The judge stared at me for a long, agonizing moment. He was searching my face for any sign of hesitation, confusion, or fear. Finding none, he picked up his heavy fountain pen. The silence in the courtroom was so profound, you could actually hear the scratch of the ink against the thick parchment paper. He signed his name at the bottom of the final page. Then he picked up his heavy wooden gavel and brought it down hard on the sounding block. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot through the massive room. The divorce was officially finalized. The legal transfer of the $12 million estate and the entire corporate entity of Vanguard Properties was now immediate and irrevocable. It was permanently binding. I was officially a man with nothing to my name but the clothes on my back and a 10-year-old pickup truck. Cynthia let out a sharp breath of pure triumph. She turned her head and looked directly at me. She smiled a bright, venomous smile that reached all the way to her cold eyes. It was a look of absolute domination. She thought she had broken me into pieces. She thought she had taken everything I spent my life building and left me to rot in the gutter. She stood up gracefully, smoothing the front of her expensive white suit, ready to walk out of the courtroom doors as a newly minted multimillionaire. She reached out and shook Fletcher's hand, congratulating him on a job well done. Fletcher was packing his case files into his briefcase, looking incredibly satisfied with his easy and lucrative victory. He reached for his mobile phone resting on the edge of the plaintiff's table. Just as his fingers brushed the glass screen, it buzzed loudly. A priority text message illuminated the display. Fletcher casually picked it up and read the notification. I watched the physical transformation happen in real time. The arrogant smirk on his face completely vanished. The healthy pink color instantly drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. His hands began to tremble so violently that he nearly dropped the device onto the floor. He read the screen again and again, as if his own eyes were deceiving him. He slowly turned his head to look at Cynthia. She was busy admiring her reflection in the dark screen of her own phone, completely oblivious to the sudden sheer panic radiating from her attorney. Fletcher swallowed hard. His breathing became incredibly shallow and rapid. He leaned over the heavy wooden table, closing the physical distance between them. He did not speak into the courtroom microphone. He did not address the judge who was busy sorting his next file. He leaned right into her ear, and his voice trembled uncontrollably as he whispered 5 terrifying words. You just assumed the debt. The echo of the heavy wooden gavel had barely faded from the cold air of the courtroom. Cynthia stood completely frozen at the table. She stared at Fletcher with a look of pure bewilderment. Her perfect white designer suit suddenly seemed rigid and suffocating. She asked him what he was talking about. Her voice was sharp and laced with deep irritation. She truly believed he was making a poor joke to ruin her moment of absolute victory. Fletcher did not look like he was joking. His face was the color of wet ash. His hands shook violently as he held his mobile phone out toward her. The screen was glaringly bright in the dim light of the large room. He told her to read the email he had just received from the Municipal Department of Building and Safety. Cynthia snatched the phone from his trembling hands. She looked down at the glowing screen. She read the subject line first. It was flagged with multiple high-priority warning markers. Emergency structural audit failure for the Avalon complex. She scoffed loudly and waved her hand in a dismissive gesture. She told Fletcher it was probably just a minor permit issue or a delayed inspection regarding the plumbing systems. She reminded him that minor municipal delays were a perfectly normal part of massive commercial real estate development. She expected him to nod and agree with her assessment. Fletcher shook his head slowly. He backed away from her slightly, as if she were carrying a highly contagious disease. He told her this was not a delayed permit or a simple plumbing issue. He explained that a team of independent municipal engineers had conducted a surprise structural audit at the Avalon construction site at 6 o'clock this morning. They brought in heavy ground drilling equipment to test the deep foundation pillars. What the engineers found beneath the surface was completely catastrophic. The concrete poured for the main subterranean supports was crumbling. It failed every single stress test and compression analysis mandated by the strict city safety codes. Cynthia felt a cold sweat break out across the back of her neck. She stared at the dense paragraphs of the official email. The words began to blur together into a terrifying wall of text. She read that the core samples extracted from the foundational columns showed extreme physical dilution. The concrete mix was heavily cut, with cheap river sand and unregulated chemical fillers. It completely lacked the essential binding agents required to support a structure of that immense size and weight. The city engineers concluded that the building was entirely unstable. If construction continued, the entire commercial complex would inevitably collapse under its own weight, causing massive casualties. She looked up at Fletcher. Her breathing became incredibly shallow and erratic. She demanded to know how this was mathematically possible. She yelled that they had hired the most expensive and prestigious lead contractor in the city. That was when the horrifying reality of her own actions finally crashed down on her shoulders. The lead contractor was a man named Neil. Neil was a charming and incredibly persuasive developer she had met at a luxury charity gala 2 years ago. I had initially refused to hire him for the Avalon project because his project bid was suspiciously low and his firm lacked a solid track record for massive commercial builds. But Cynthia had fought me relentlessly on that specific business decision. She had thrown screaming tantrums in our home, threatening to humiliate me socially if I did not give the massive contract to her preferred choice. She claimed he was an architectural visionary. What she did not tell me was that she was secretly sleeping with him. They had been carrying on an illicit romantic affair in luxury hotel rooms paid for by my corporate accounts. She had forced Neil into the lead contractor position so he could skim profits and inflate his own professional reputation. But Neil was not just skimming a little cash off the top of the ledger. The city inspection report outlined a massive coordinated embezzlement scheme. Neil had deliberately ordered substandard diluted concrete for the massive foundational pours. He charged Vanguard Properties the premium price for top-tier industrial materials and quietly pocketed the massive financial difference. He had stolen millions of dollars directly from the construction budget while systematically turning the Avalon complex into a giant concrete death trap. Cynthia felt her knees go completely weak. She braced herself against the heavy wooden table to keep from collapsing onto the polished floor. She realized with sudden clarity that Neil had completely vanished. He had stopped answering her private phone calls 2 days ago, claiming he was going on a brief hunting trip in the mountains. He was not on a hunting trip. He had taken the embezzled millions and fled the state the moment he caught wind of the surprise municipal audit. He had run away and left her holding the bag. Fletcher took his phone back from her limp hand. He scrolled down to the very bottom of the email, to the section marked with red, urgent headers. He read the official mandate aloud in the empty courtroom. His voice was completely hollow and defeated. He stated that the Department of Building and Safety had officially condemned the entire Avalon property. The massive construction site was currently locked down and surrounded by police barricades. All construction was halted permanently. Cynthia tried desperately to catch her breath. She told Fletcher they could just sue Neil for the damages. She said they could hire a new crew to pour new concrete and fix the foundation. She frantically tried to cling to the delusion that her newly acquired empire could still be salvaged. Fletcher looked at her with a mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust. He realized he was never going to get paid for his legal services. He explained that pouring new concrete required demolishing what was already there. He read the final paragraph of the city mandate. The municipality was ordering the immediate safe demolition of the unstable structure to prevent a catastrophic collapse into the neighboring streets. Furthermore, the city was issuing a massive environmental cleanup and restitution penalty for violating the core building safety codes. The total estimated cost of the mandatory demolition and the municipal fines was exactly $15 million. Cynthia gasped heavily. The sound was high and panicked like a drowning woman breaking the surface of the water for a single second. She shook her head frantically side to side. She told Fletcher that Vanguard Properties could simply file for corporate bankruptcy to absorb the massive financial blow. She said the debt would just dissolve into the corporate structure and she could walk away clean with the house and the cars. Fletcher slowly zipped his leather briefcase shut. The sound was incredibly loud. He looked her directly in the eyes and delivered the final crushing blow. He reminded her of the specific legal documents she had just signed with tremendous pride 10 minutes ago. He reminded her of the aggressive, watertight indemnification clauses she had demanded to keep me entirely away from her money. She had insisted on being named the sole proprietor, the only voting shareholder, and the absolute guarantor of all corporate liabilities. She wanted no legal loopholes that would allow me to claim a single penny of the company revenue. Because of that exact specific phrasing, Vanguard Properties was no longer shielded as a separate limited liability entity. She had personally guaranteed its operations to secure the immediate transfer of wealth. The $15 million municipal mandate was not just a corporate debt anymore. It was her personal debt. The city would legally attach the massive fine directly to her name. They would put immediate liens on the primary estate she had just acquired. They would seize the luxury cars sitting in the driveway. They would completely freeze her personal bank accounts before the sun went down. The $12 million in assets she thought she had brilliantly stolen from me were instantly rendered completely toxic. They were nothing but collateral waiting to be seized by the city to pay for the fraudulent concrete. She had fought tooth and nail to secure a massive financial empire, and she had successfully won a $15 million grave. Cynthia collapsed heavily into the leather chair behind her. The flawless designer suit suddenly looked like a tragic costume. She put her trembling hands over her face and let out a long, agonizing wail of pure despair. It was the devastating sound of a woman realizing that her own boundless greed had been the exact weapon used to destroy her. I did not stay to watch her cry. I had already turned my back and walked quietly out of the courtroom, leaving her entirely alone in the icy ruins of her own making. Monday morning arrived with a bitter frost covering the city. Cynthia did not sleep over the weekend. She had spent the last 48 hours frantically pacing the empty halls of the massive estate trying to formulate an escape plan. She was terrified, but she still believed she was the smartest person in any room. She thought the municipal government was slow and bureaucratic. She calculated that it would take the city at least a week to process the $15 million restitution mandate through the court system. She decided to beat them to the punch. Her plan was incredibly simple and entirely illegal. She intended to liquidate every single available dollar from the Vanguard properties. Operating accounts drain her personal savings and wire the entire sum to a private offshore banking facility in the Cayman Islands. She thought she could hide the money and let the city foreclose on an empty corporate shell. She dressed in a sharp black blazer and large designer sunglasses, hoping to project an image of absolute control. She drove one of the luxury sedans downtown to her exclusive private wealth management branch. This was not a standard bank. It was a high-security boutique firm that catered exclusively to the ultra-wealthy. The floors were imported Italian marble, and the tellers sat behind thick, polished mahogany desks instead of bulletproof glass. Cynthia had been a premium client here for over a decade, using the corporate wealth I had built to secure her elite status. She walked through the heavy glass doors, expecting the usual obsequious treatment. She bypassed the small waiting area and marched directly up to the Platinum Services desk. A young male teller greeted her with a polite smile. Cynthia did not return the greeting. She reached into her expensive leather handbag, pulled out her heavy metal debit card, and slapped it down onto the polished wood. She instructed the teller to initiate an immediate international wire transfer. She slid a piece of paper across the desk containing the routing numbers for the offshore account. She demanded that he transfer $4 million from the Vanguard Properties primary operating fund and another $800,000 from her personal checking account. She told him to expedite the process and waive the standard holding period, claiming she was closing a massive international real estate deal by noon. The teller nodded professionally and began typing the information into his terminal. He inserted her metal card into the reader. He clicked the final authorization button. The computer system emitted a sharp, low beep. The teller frowned. He looked at the screen and then looked back at the card. He apologized quietly, stating there seemed to be a minor glitch in the network. He pulled the card out, wiped the chip with his thumb, and inserted it again. The system beeped a second time. This time the screen flashed a solid, bright red. The teller's polite smile completely vanished. He stared at his monitor with wide eyes. Cynthia crossed her arms impatiently. She tapped her expensive heel against the marble floor. She asked him what the problem was, her voice dripping with condescension. She demanded he stop wasting her time and process the transaction manually if he had to. She reminded him of her premium account status and threatened to have him fired for incompetence. The teller did not apologize this time. He slowly pushed her metal card back across the mahogany desk. He looked deeply uncomfortable. He lowered his voice to a whisper and told her he could not process the wire transfer. He said he could not process any transactions at all. He informed her that her platinum card had just been permanently declined by the Central Banking Authority. Cynthia scoffed loudly. She snatched the card off the desk. She told him he was an idiot and demanded to speak to the senior branch manager immediately. She yelled that she had millions of dollars in those accounts, and a simple machine error was not going to stop her business deal. The commotion echoed through the quiet bank, drawing the attention of several other wealthy clients. The senior branch manager, a man named Gregory, hurried out of his glass office. He had known Cynthia for years and usually greeted her with a warm handshake and a cup of artisan coffee. Today, he looked incredibly pale and nervous. He did not offer his hand. He gestured toward his private office, asking her to step inside so they could discuss the matter discreetly. Cynthia marched into his office and sat down heavily in the leather guest chair. She demanded he fix his broken computer system and fire the young teller for disrespecting her. Gregory closed the glass door and locked it. He sat down behind his desk, but he did not touch his computer. He folded his hands together and looked her directly in the eyes. He told her there was absolutely nothing wrong with the computer system. He explained that her accounts were not experiencing a technical glitch. They were entirely frozen. Cynthia stared at him. She asked him what he meant by frozen. Gregory pulled a thick stack of printed legal documents from his top drawer and pushed them across the desk. He explained that the city did not wait for the standard bureaucratic timeline. The Department of Building and Safety recognized the massive flight risk associated with the Avalon complex disaster. They had completely bypassed the standard procedural queue and gone straight to an emergency federal duty judge over the weekend. The judge had reviewed the catastrophic concrete failure and immediately issued a sweeping federal lien against Vanguard Properties to secure the $15 million restitution mandate. Cynthia waved her hand dismissively. She told Gregory to just freeze the corporate accounts then. She pointed out that the wire transfer she requested also included her personal funds. She demanded he release her personal checking and savings accounts immediately so she could at least access her own money. Gregory shook his head. He looked at her with a mixture of pity and professional detachment. He reminded her of the specific legal structuring of her divorce settlement. He explained that because she had aggressively demanded sole indemnified ownership of Vanguard Properties to keep me away from the assets, she had destroyed the corporate veil. She was the sole proprietor and the absolute guarantor of the company. Therefore, the federal lien did not stop at the corporate boundary. It extended directly to her personal Social Security number. Gregory stated clearly that every single financial asset tied to her name was completely locked down by the federal government. Her corporate accounts were frozen. Her personal checking accounts were frozen. Her retirement portfolios, her emergency savings, and even her credit cards were entirely deactivated. She could not withdraw $100 from an automated teller machine, let alone wire millions to an offshore sanctuary. The bank was legally prohibited from releasing a single penny to her until the $15 million municipal debt was paid in full. She was effectively entirely bankrupt. Cynthia felt the air leave her lungs. The pristine glass walls of the office seemed to close in around her. She looked down at the metal card in her hand. It was now just a worthless piece of metal. She realized she had no cash to buy groceries, no cash to put gas in her luxury car, and absolutely no cash to hire a criminal defense attorney to fight the city. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She did not say goodbye to Gregory. She stumbled out of the office, walked numbly through the bank lobby, and pushed her way out into the freezing street. She sat in the driver's seat of her car, shivering uncontrollably. The panic was no longer a looming threat. It was a physical weight crushing her chest. She needed money immediately just to survive the week. Then she remembered Neil. Neil was the lead contractor who had skimmed millions from the concrete budget. He was the man she had been sleeping with. He had the stolen cash. She convinced herself that he loved her and would split the embezzled money with her so they could flee the country together. She frantically dug her mobile phone out of her purse. She scrolled through her contacts and tapped the encrypted private number Neil used exclusively to communicate with her. She held the phone to her ear, her hands trembling violently. The line did not ring. A cold, automated voice clicked onto the speaker. The voice stated that the number she was trying to reach had been disconnected and was no longer in service. Cynthia dropped the phone into her lap. A cold wave of absolute terror washed over her. She started the car and sped toward the upscale downtown district. She broke several traffic laws driving recklessly until she reached the luxury high-rise condominium where Neil lived. She parked illegally in the loading zone and ran past the front desk concierge. She took the elevator up to the penthouse level. She pounded her fists against his heavy mahogany door. She screamed his name, demanding he open up. The door next to his opened instead. An elderly neighbor peered out, looking highly annoyed. The neighbor told Cynthia to stop screaming. The neighbor explained that Neil had packed a single suitcase and rushed out of the building late Friday night, tossing his apartment keys to the building manager on his way to the private airfield. He had not returned. Cynthia slowly backed away from the door. She slumped against the cold hallway wall, sliding down until she hit the floor. Neil had not loved her. He had used her to secure the most lucrative contracting job in the city. He had used her blind greed to approve his fraudulent supply orders. And the moment the audit hit, he had taken the millions he stole and vanished, leaving her to take the entire fall. She sat alone in the quiet hallway, completely penniless, abandoned by her lover, and totally trapped by the exact legal documents she had used to destroy my life. It was raining heavily on Tuesday evening, creating a dull, constant roar against the thin glass of the single window in the apartment belonging to Aaron. The heating system in the old building was broken again, so the air inside was damp and bitterly cold. I was sitting at the small laminate kitchen table, going over his latest physical therapy schedule while he finished his upper body exercises in the living room. The cramped apartment was quiet and entirely removed from the high-stakes corporate disaster unfolding downtown. Then the heavy pounding started. It was not a polite knock or a simple tap. It was a frantic, violent hammering against the cheap metal door. The entire frame rattled with the sheer force of the repeated blows. Aaron stopped his exercises, his breathing heavy, and wheeled his chair around, looking highly alarmed. I held up a hand and told him to stay put. I stood up from the small wobbly table and walked slowly down the narrow, dim hallway. The pounding continued without pause, accompanied by a muffled, shrill voice screaming my name through the cheap wood. I reached out and turned the deadbolt, pulling the heavy door open. Cynthia stood in the bleak hallway, dripping wet from the storm outside. She looked absolutely nothing like the radiant, victorious woman who had paraded through the courtroom in a pristine white designer suit just a few days prior. The transformation was staggering. Her expensive silk blouse was soaked through and plastered to her skin. Her hair, which was usually styled with meticulous care, hung in tangled wet strands across her face. Her dark eye makeup was completely smeared, running down her pale cheeks, making her look hollow, desperate, and completely unhinged. She did not wait for an invitation. She pushed past me roughly, her wet shoulder grazing my chest, as she barged into the tiny apartment, carrying the smell of wet wool and sheer, absolute panic. She stormed right into the center of the cramped living room, completely ignoring our paralyzed son sitting in his wheelchair just a few feet away. She spun around to face me, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. She pointed a violently trembling finger at my face and began screaming at the top of her lungs. She accused me of setting her up. She yelled that I was a manipulative monster who had intentionally orchestrated the entire downfall of the Avalon complex, just to ruin her life. She claimed I knew the federal government was going to audit the foundation and freeze her accounts, and that I had deliberately tricked her into taking the company so she would absorb the massive financial blow. She reached into her wet, ruined leather handbag and pulled out a crumpled stack of legal documents. She threw them onto the cheap linoleum floor at my feet. She demanded that I call my attorney immediately and draft a full reversal of the divorce settlement. She ordered me to take Vanguard Properties back into my name right now, claiming the original transfer was signed under fraudulent pretenses, and she would not be held liable for my mistakes. She paced back and forth in the tiny space, her voice echoing sharply off the bare plaster walls. She screamed that she had $0 to her name, that her platinum credit cards were bouncing at the grocery store, and that she was going to be thrown out of the primary estate by the end of the month if I did not fix the massive mess I had created. I did not raise my voice to match hers. I did not bend down to pick up the crumpled papers she had thrown on the floor. I walked calmly over to a cheap metal folding chair and sat down, crossing my arms over my chest. I looked at her with complete total detachment. I waited for her to stop screaming and catch her breath. I let the silence stretch out, making her hyper-aware of how chaotic and pathetic she looked standing in a puddle of rainwater on the floor of our sun. When the room finally went quiet, except for the sound of the storm outside, I spoke. I kept my tone perfectly level and completely devoid of any empathy. I told her I did not trick her into doing anything. I reminded her that she was the one who marched into my kitchen and threw those divorce papers onto the granite island. She was the one who hired a ruthless, expensive attorney to draft a settlement demanding total and uncontested ownership of the commercial real estate empire. She was the one who insisted on absolute watertight indemnification to guarantee I could never touch what she considered to be her money. I explained that I simply picked up a pen and gave her exactly what she asked for. I did not force her to be greedy. I did not force her to cut her own disabled son out of her life to protect her precious wealth. Her own supreme arrogance and staggering sense of entitlement had built the exact trap she was currently caught in. I just opened the door and let her walk inside it all by herself. Cynthia shook her head frantically, sending droplets of water flying from her hair. She stammered that I had a legal and moral obligation to disclose the structural failures before I signed the company over. She threatened to drag me back into federal court and expose my gross negligence to the judge. I let out a very soft, quiet laugh. The sound made her stop dead in her tracks. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. I looked her dead in the eyes and told her she could not expose my negligence because I was not the one managing the Avalon project anymore. She was. I asked her if she really thought I was completely blind. I asked her if she honestly believed I did not know about her secret romantic rendezvous with Neil, the lead contractor at the luxury downtown hotel. Cynthia gasped audibly, taking a physical step backward as if I had struck her across the face. Her jaw dropped, and her face drained of whatever color was left. I told her I had known about the affair for over 6 months. I had seen the credit card charges she thought she was cleverly hiding. I also knew that Neil was a second-rate developer who was completely unqualified for a commercial project of that magnitude. I knew he was buying cheap, diluted river sand concrete and pocketing the massive financial difference. I explained that I had initially tried to fire him to save the project and protect the company, but she had fought me tooth and nail to keep her lover on the payroll. She had thrown tantrums and threatened to destroy my social standing if I removed him from the site. So I stepped back and let her have exactly what she wanted. She wanted Neil in charge of the foundation, and I let him pour the concrete that would eventually bury her alive. She began to hyperventilate, clutching her chest, as the absolute reality of the situation washed over her. She realized I had known everything from the very beginning. She realized I had watched her dig her own grave and simply handed her a bigger shovel. She stammered out a final desperate, pathetic threat, claiming she would sue me for hiding the liability during the divorce negotiations. She said the judge would throw me in jail for concealing the imminent municipal audit and failing to provide a transparent financial ledger. I stood up from the folding chair and walked over to the small kitchen counter. I picked up a pristine printed copy of our final divorce decree that I had kept perfectly flat in a manila folder. I walked back over to her and pressed the heavy document firmly into her trembling hands. I told her to read paragraph 4 on page 7. It was the specific clause her own aggressive lawyer had drafted to expedite the divorce and lock me out of the assets as quickly as possible. I read the words aloud to her so she could hear them clearly over her own panicked breathing. The clause explicitly stated that the plaintiff voluntarily and permanently waived her right to any and all financial discovery. She had legally blinded herself to the internal company ledgers because she was in such a massive, desperate rush to steal the empire before I could fight back. I stepped back and looked at the broken, soaking wet woman standing in the middle of the room. I told her she was legally trapped in the burning building she had demanded to own, and I was never going to unlock the door. I did not need to physically follow Cynthia back to the primary estate to know exactly what happened next. When I built that massive house, I personally designed and installed a state-of-the-art exterior security system. The high-definition cameras and motion sensors were hardwired into a private encrypted server that I controlled from my laptop. When I surrendered the property in the divorce settlement, I intentionally left the camera network completely intact and quietly transferred the administrative access to my own private network. I sat at the small kitchen table in the apartment of my son and opened my laptop. I watched the live video feed as the next phase of her absolute financial ruin arrived right at her front door. The storm that had soaked her to the bone was still raging across the city. The rain fell in heavy, relentless sheets, turning the immaculate landscaping of the estate into a muddy swamp. Through the wide-angle lens of the driveway camera, I watched a convoy of 3 heavy-duty commercial flatbed tow trucks pull through the wrought iron front gates. The massive diesel engines roared over the sound of the rain. The flashing amber caution lights on the roofs of the trucks cast long, frantic shadows across the pristine brick driveway. The trucks backed up slowly, positioning themselves perfectly in front of the 3 luxury vehicles parked near the temperature-controlled garage. These were the 3 vehicles Cynthia had explicitly demanded in the divorce settlement. There was a sleek black European sports car, a massive luxury sport utility vehicle, and a custom-ordered imported sedan. They were pristine status symbols worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. They were the cars she used to parade around her elite country club and project an image of untouchable wealth. The tow truck operators stepped out of their cabs wearing heavy yellow rain slickers. They moved with fast, practiced efficiency. They unspooled the thick steel winch cables and began hooking them directly to the undercarriages of the luxury vehicles. A few minutes later, Cynthia drove through the open gates in her own personal car. She parked haphazardly on the grass lawn, completely ignoring the landscaping. She threw her car door open and stumbled out into the pouring rain. She looked absolutely frantic. Even through the grainy feed of the security camera, I could see the sheer panic radiating from her posture. She ran toward the tow truck operators, waving her arms wildly and screaming at them to stop touching her property. She threw herself between the heavy steel winch of the first truck and the front bumper of the European sports car, demanding that they unhook the vehicles immediately. The foreman of the repossession crew stepped forward. He was a large, broad-shouldered man holding a waterproof electronic clipboard. He did not look intimidated by her screaming. He had dealt with angry, bankrupt billionaires before. Cynthia demanded to know who he was and threatened to call the police to report a grand theft. The foreman calmly wiped the rain from his face and looked at his clipboard. He asked her for her name to confirm her identity. When she proudly stated that she was the sole owner of the estate, he handed her a thick stack of printed legal notices. He explained the harsh reality of corporate automotive leasing to her. Wealthy individuals rarely purchase depreciating assets like luxury cars with cash. Instead, I had leased those 3 vehicles under the corporate umbrella of Vanguard Properties, using them as massive business tax write-offs. Cynthia had demanded the cars in the divorce, but she had also demanded the company that held their leases. The foreman explained that the moment the federal judge issued the emergency lien against Vanguard Properties, all corporate bank accounts were instantly frozen. The automatic monthly lease payments for the 3 vehicles had bounced that morning. The bank that owned the cars did not care about her divorce or her personal problems. The bank saw a massive commercial real estate firm enter sudden federal default, and they immediately dispatched a recovery team to secure their high-value automotive assets. The foreman stated clearly that the leases were officially breached. The cars no longer belonged to Vanguard Properties, and they certainly did not belong to her. He instructed his crew to continue their work. Cynthia stood in the pouring rain, completely paralyzed by the explanation. She watched the heavy steel cables pull tight. The sleek black sports car slowly rolled forward, dragged mercilessly onto the tilted steel ramp of the first flatbed truck. She realized that her personal car, the one she had just driven home, was almost entirely out of gas. With her credit cards frozen and her bank accounts locked, she had absolutely no way to refuel it. If these 3 luxury vehicles were taken away, she would be entirely stranded at the estate with no transportation and no money to hire a private car. The panic completely overrode her usual crushing pride. She ran up to the foreman again, but this time she was not screaming. She was begging. She pleaded with him to leave just one of the cars. She promised him that it was all a giant clerical error and the bank would have their money by the end of the week. The foreman shook his head and told her he did not have the authority to negotiate. His job was simply to secure the assets and return them to the bank lot. Cynthia became desperate. She realized her words held no value, so she resorted to the only currency she had left on her physical body. Her hands shook violently as she reached up to her neck and unclasped a heavy diamond necklace. She pulled off a thick platinum tennis bracelet and removed 2 large diamond stud earrings. She held the glittering jewelry out in the pouring rain, offering it directly to the foreman. She begged him to take the diamonds as a personal cash bribe just to leave the sport utility vehicle in the driveway. It was an incredibly pathetic sight. The woman who had marched into a courtroom demanding a $12 million empire was now standing in a puddle, sobbing and trying to pawn her own jewelry to a tow truck driver just to keep a car. The foreman looked down at the handful of diamonds. He did not reach for them. He looked back up at Cynthia with a profound look of professional disgust. He told her to put her jewelry away before she dropped it in the mud. He stepped around her, walked back to his truck, and climbed into the dry cab. The heavy hydraulic lifts groaned loudly as the 3 flatbed trucks leveled out. Cynthia stood completely alone on the wet driveway, clutching her diamonds as the diesel engines roared. She watched the convoy turn around and drive slowly back through the wrought iron gates, dragging her precious status symbols down the dark street and out of her life forever. She stood in the rain for a long time, watching the red taillights disappear into the storm. When she finally turned around and walked toward the massive front doors of the estate, she looked entirely defeated. She keyed her entry code into the front door pad and stumbled inside the grand foyer. The security cameras tracked her movements as she dragged her soaking wet clothes across the expensive hardwood floors. I watched the live feed on my laptop screen with absolute cold precision. I knew exactly what was about to happen next. Cynthia walked into the massive living room, wrapping her arms around herself to stop the violent shivering. She walked over to the digital thermostat mounted on the wall to turn on the central heating system. She tapped the glass screen. It was completely dark. She tapped it again, pressing her fingers frantically against the dead glass. Suddenly, the grand crystal chandelier hanging above the foyer flickered once. The soft ambient lighting illuminating the long hallways flickered twice. Then, with a heavy echoing click, the entire house went pitch black. The low, constant hum of the massive heating and cooling units completely died. The refrigerator stopped running. The wireless internet routers powered down. The estate fell into absolute total silence. Cynthia had been so focused on stealing the corporate wealth that she completely ignored the foundational logistics of running a massive residential property. When I built the house, I registered all the major utility accounts under the Vanguard Properties corporate umbrella to streamline the accounting and manage the massive monthly electrical and water bills. Just like the luxury cars, the utilities were paid via automatic corporate bank transfers. When the federal government froze the Vanguard accounts, the municipal utility companies were instantly notified of the massive default. They did not grant grace periods to bankrupt corporations. They simply cut the power from the main city grid. I watched the final seconds of the security feed as the backup battery power on the cameras slowly drained. The last image I saw before the screen went entirely black was Cynthia standing alone in the pitch-dark, freezing living room. She was trapped in a cold, empty, cavernous mansion with no electricity, no heat, no vehicles, no money, and absolutely no one coming to save her. I closed my laptop quietly. The silent adjustment was proceeding exactly as planned. The sun rose over the frozen city, but it brought absolutely no warmth to the cavernous estate. Cynthia woke up on a velvet sofa, wrapped in a thin, decorative throw blanket. Her bones ached from the bitter cold of the unheated house. She had spent the night in total darkness, listening to the wind howl against the massive glass windows. Her mobile phone battery was completely dead. She had no hot water to take a shower. She had no coffee to drink and no food in the refrigerator that would not quickly spoil. She had nothing but the crushing realization that she was completely trapped. But Cynthia was not the type of woman to accept defeat gracefully. Her panic slowly mutated back into a venomous, frantic anger. She convinced herself that I had committed a massive legal crime by allowing her to sign that settlement. She decided she was going to march down to the office of her vicious attorney and force him to draft a massive fraud lawsuit against me. She was going to drag me into federal court and make me pay for the municipal fines. Without her luxury vehicles and with completely frozen bank accounts, she could not hire a private car service. She could not even summon a cheap taxi. She was forced to do something she had not done in 30 years. She had to walk. She put on a heavy wool coat over her wrinkled clothes from the day before and stepped out into the freezing morning air. The walk from the exclusive gated community to the downtown legal district was over 5 miles. She trudged along the sides of busy highways, her expensive leather boots blistering her heels. Cars splashed dirty, melting snow against her legs. By the time she reached the towering glass skyscraper that housed the prestigious law firm, she looked like a completely different person. She was disheveled, exhausted, and radiating a desperate, manic energy. She pushed through those heavy revolving doors and marched straight toward the bank of private elevators. She intended to ride up to the 50th floor and barge right into the corner office of Fletcher, just like she had done during our divorce negotiations. A large security guard wearing a sharp black suit stepped directly into her path, holding up a heavy hand. He politely but firmly asked for her identification and her appointment confirmation. Cynthia scoffed loudly, attempting to summon her usual arrogant authority. She yelled that she did not need an appointment. She proudly stated that she was a premium client of the firm and demanded the guard step aside immediately. The receptionist, sitting behind a massive marble desk, picked up a phone and dialed a short extension. She spoke in hushed tones, watching Cynthia with a mixture of alarm and professional disdain. A few agonizing minutes passed while Cynthia stood in the bustling lobby surrounded by wealthy corporate clients who stared at her wet, disheveled appearance. Finally, the silver doors of the executive elevator slid open. Fletcher stepped out into the lobby. He wore a pristine tailored suit and carried a sleek leather folder under his arm. Cynthia rushed toward him, her heels clicking frantically against the polished floor. She began talking immediately, not even pausing to catch her breath. She demanded that he take her upstairs. She ordered him to draft a comprehensive fraud and gross negligence lawsuit against me before the end of the day. She claimed she had been severely manipulated and that he needed to file an emergency injunction to freeze my personal assets. Fletcher did not invite her into the elevator. He did not offer her a warm cup of coffee or a sympathetic smile. He stopped walking and stood rigidly in the center of the public lobby, forcing her to speak to him in front of the security guards and the receptionist. He looked at her with a completely blank expression. He told her to lower her voice and stop making a scene. He informed her that he was not going to draft a lawsuit against me. He was not going to file an emergency injunction. In fact, he was not going to do absolutely anything for her ever again. He handed her the sleek leather folder he was carrying. Cynthia opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a formal letter of termination. Fletcher explained in a cold, detached voice that his accounting department had attempted to process her massive legal retainer fee the previous afternoon. The transaction was completely blocked by the federal government due to the emergency municipal lien placed on all of her accounts. Her corporate funds were frozen. Her personal funds were frozen. She was entirely, completely bankrupt. Fletcher stated that his firm did not operate as a charity. Since she could no longer pay his exorbitant hourly rate, he was officially dropping her as a client effective immediately. Cynthia stared at the termination letter, her mouth opening and closing in silent shock. She crumpled the thick paper in her fist and threatened to report him to the State Bar Association for abandoning her in the middle of a legal crisis. She yelled that she would hire another lawyer and sue him for malpractice right after she finished suing me for fraud. Fletcher let out a short, humorless laugh. He leaned closer to her, dropping his voice to a dangerous whisper so the surrounding lobby could not hear. He told her she was completely delusional. He explained the brutal, unforgiving reality of civil litigation. He told her that if she somehow found a cheap, desperate lawyer to file a fraud lawsuit against me, she would trigger a massive legal discovery process. The judge would demand total transparency to determine exactly who knew what about the Avalon complex. Fletcher spelled it out for her slowly and clearly. He said that a discovery phase would require her to hand over her personal mobile phone, her encrypted laptop, and all of her private communication records. The court would legally subpoena her text messages, her emails, and her location data. He stared directly into her panicked eyes and reminded her about Neil. He told her the court forensic accountants would immediately find the hundreds of secret messages between her and the lead contractor. They would see that she was having a romantic affair with the man who poured the fraudulent concrete. They would read the emails where she explicitly instructed Neil to cut corners and hide the supply receipts to maximize the company valuation before the divorce was finalized. Fletcher backed away from her, adjusting his silk tie. He warned her that suing me would not just be a massive waste of time. It would hand the district attorney the exact written evidence they needed to charge her with corporate conspiracy and criminal fraud. He told her that if she filed that lawsuit, she would be trading her frozen mansion for a cell in a federal penitentiary. Fletcher turned around and walked back toward the private elevators, leaving her standing completely frozen in the middle of the lobby. The security guard stepped forward and firmly instructed her to exit the building. She did not argue. The absolute terror of a criminal conviction completely silenced her. She walked blindly back out into the freezing city streets. She spent the entire afternoon trudging miles back to the dark, unheated estate. Her feet were bleeding, her clothes were ruined, and her mind was completely shattered. She had no legal representation, no money, and absolutely no hope of fighting back in court. As she finally limped up the long brick driveway of the property, she saw something fluttering in the cold wind. It was a bright yellow piece of heavy paper securely taped to the front door. She pulled it off the wood and read the bold black print. It was an official notice of foreclosure. The federal lien had triggered an immediate cross-default on the massive property taxes associated with the estate. The bank was legally seizing the property to satisfy the municipal creditors, and she was given less than a week to entirely vacate the premises. While Cynthia was walking through the freezing streets to be rejected by her attorney Aaron, and I were sitting in a very warm, very comfortable boardroom on the top floor of a commercial lending institution. It was a private wealth management firm that handled corporate structuring and high-yield investments, completely separated from the bank that held the Vanguard accounts. I pushed the wheelchair of my son up to the massive mahogany table. The senior loan officer, a man named Bradley, looked at us with a polite but highly skeptical expression. He knew my name. He knew the news sweeping through the financial district that Vanguard Properties was currently suffocating under a massive federal lien. He politely asked how he could possibly assist a man who had just legally surrendered his entire financial portfolio and rendered himself completely bankrupt on paper. I did not answer him. I let my son do the talking. Aaron reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the sealed leather folder containing the engineering patents. He slid the folder across the polished wood table. He told Bradley that Vanguard Properties was entirely dead, but the technology used to build half the commercial structures in the city was very much alive and completely under his exclusive control. Bradley opened the folder and reviewed the certified legal documents. His skeptical expression vanished immediately. He saw the continuous royalty streams pouring in from dozens of active construction sites across the entire state. The patents generated a massive amount of liquid capital, that was entirely isolated from the Vanguard collapse. Aaron instructed Bradley to take those royalty funds and establish a brand new limited liability company. We named it Apex Restoration. Within 2 hours, the expedited paperwork was filed with the State Commerce Department. Apex Restoration was officially incorporated, with Aaron listed as the sole majority owner and chief executive officer. We left the bank and went to a quiet diner near the financial district to review our next immediate move. I sat across the table from my son, pouring 2 cups of black coffee, and laid out the harsh reality of municipal bureaucracy. I explained that the city government did not actually want to own the Avalon complex. The city council members were not real estate developers or construction experts. They were politicians and bureaucrats who were currently terrified of a massive crumbling concrete hazard sitting directly in the middle of their valuable downtown district. The $15 million restitution mandate they slapped on Vanguard properties was completely useless to them if Cynthia could not actually pay it. And since Cynthia was entirely bankrupt and locked out of her own accounts, the city was facing the political nightmare of using millions of taxpayer dollars to demolish the dangerous site themselves. I told Aaron that the city council was absolutely desperate for a private sector savior to step in and take the radioactive problem off their hands before it destroyed their political careers. That was exactly where Apex Restoration came into play. We were not going to build a new company from scratch and compete in the open market. We were going to absorb the ruins of the old company and use them to build an impenetrable fortress. Aaron listened to my plan and nodded slowly, taking a sip of his coffee. The raw anger that had consumed him a few days ago was completely gone, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. He realized that we were not just securing our financial future. We were engineering a complete total reversal of power using the exact system Cynthia thought she had mastered. The emergency closed-door meeting with the city council took place at 3 o'clock that afternoon. The room was incredibly tense and smelled of stale coffee and nervous sweat. 5 elected officials sat at a long curved table looking completely exhausted. The mayor was present alongside the head of the Department of Building and Safety. They had spent the entire weekend fielding angry, terrified phone calls from downtown business owners who feared the Avalon Foundation would collapse and sink the surrounding city blocks. I pushed Aaron right into the center of the room. The mayor recognized me immediately and frowned deeply, assuming I was there to beg for a grace period or a reduction in fines on behalf of Vanguard properties. I corrected him instantly. I stated for the official public record that I had absolutely zero legal affiliation with Vanguard Properties or my former wife. I introduced Aaron as the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Restoration. I handed the mayor a thick, professionally bound proposal. I explained that we were there to offer a complete private solution to their massive public nightmare. Apex Restoration was prepared to completely take over the condemned Avalon complex site. We guaranteed the safe structural demolition of the fraudulent concrete and the complete environmental cleanup of the surrounding area using our own private capital. Furthermore, we would rebuild the commercial complex using the proprietary structural dampeners and reinforced materials that Aaron legally owned, preventing any future safety hazards. The proposal outlined a flawless, fully funded recovery plan that would cost the city absolutely nothing in public taxpayer dollars. The council members read through the proposal in stunned, absolute silence. The head of building and safety looked at the financial guarantees backed by the continuous patent royalties and nodded enthusiastically at the mayor. It was a miracle cure for their most pressing political crisis. But the mayor was a highly cautious man. He put the proposal down and asked what Apex Restoration wanted in return for this massive, incredibly expensive undertaking. I did not hesitate for a single second. I told him we wanted the city to sell us the exact municipal debt currently crushing Vanguard properties. I offered to purchase the $15 million restitution mandate and the associated federal liens for exactly 2 cents on the dollar. The city would get an immediate cash injection, and more importantly, they would entirely wash their hands of the Avalon disaster forever. By selling the debt to us, the city would legally transfer the ownership of the condemned land and all associated financial penalties directly to Apex Restoration. The council did not even leave the room to deliberate. The profound fear of a public building collapse and the golden promise of a private bailout made the decision incredibly easy. They called the head city attorney into the room and drafted the transfer agreements right there on the spot. Aaron picked up a pen and signed his name on the dotted line officially authorizing the purchase. The mayor shook his hand and thanked him profusely for saving the downtown commercial district. We rolled out of the municipal building as the sun began to set over the city skyline. The cold winter air felt incredibly crisp and clean. We had just completely legally purchased the $15 million debt. Apex Restoration, owned exclusively by my paralyzed son, was now the primary senior creditor of the Vanguard Properties collapse. The massive, crushing financial weight that was actively destroying Cynthia was no longer held by a faceless government bureaucracy. It was held directly in the hands of the very son she had so cruelly discarded. Wednesday morning brought a bitter, biting wind that swept through the city streets. Cynthia was entirely out of options and completely out of food. With the massive estate completely dark and her luxury vehicles repossessed, she was forced to endure the ultimate indignity for a woman of her supreme arrogance. She had to take the public city bus. She walked 2 miles from the gated community to the nearest bus stop, shivering in a heavy wool coat she had salvaged from a dark closet. She rode the crowded, noisy bus all the way to a discount grocery store on the edge of the city. It was a massive, cavernous warehouse with harsh, flickering fluorescent lights and cheap linoleum floors. It was the kind of place she used to mock when she drove past it in her imported European sports car. Now it was the only place she could afford to enter. She had managed to dig through her designer handbags and winter coats, finding a handful of crumpled $20 bills and some loose change. This was her entire net worth. She walked down the narrow, crowded aisles carrying a red plastic shopping basket. Her eyes nervously scanned the price tags on canned soups and loaves of generic white bread. She was mentally calculating every single penny, terrified that she would not have enough cash when she reached the checkout register. Her hair was pulled back into a messy knot, and dark circles shadowed her eyes. She looked entirely broken, but her mind was still frantically trying to find a way out of the disaster. She turned down the cereal aisle, entirely focused on a row of cheap oatmeal, when a man in a plain beige windbreaker stepped directly into her path. He was an average-looking man holding a thick manila envelope. He did not look like a shopper. He looked at her face and then looked down at a photograph he held in his hand. He asked her if she was Cynthia. She immediately tensed up. Her first instinct was to lie and walk away, assuming he was a debt collector sent by the utility companies or the bank holding the foreclosure notice. She turned her head and tried to push past him, claiming he had the wrong person. The man did not move. He reached out and tapped the thick envelope against her arm. He stated clearly that he was a registered process server and that she had officially been served. He dropped the heavy envelope directly into her red plastic basket, right on top of a box of dry cereal. He turned around and walked away without another word, blending seamlessly into the crowd of morning shoppers. Cynthia stood frozen in the middle of the cereal aisle. She stared down at the thick envelope resting in her basket. A deep, nauseating dread washed over her. She assumed it was from me. She assumed my attorney Warren had filed another brutal legal motion to completely lock her out of any remaining Vanguard Properties assets, or perhaps Aaron was suing her for the medical trust she had tried to dissolve. She abandoned the plastic basket entirely, leaving the food she desperately needed on the floor. She grabbed the envelope and rushed out of the grocery store through the automatic sliding doors. She walked over to a cold concrete bench near the bus stop and sat down. Her hands were shaking violently as she tore the heavy paper open. She pulled out a massive stack of legal documents. She looked at the top page, expecting to see the logo of my downtown law firm. Instead, she saw a massive official seal stamped in dark blue ink. It was not a civil court header. It was the official seal of the state district attorney. The bold black letters across the top of the page indicated a federal grand jury subpoena. Cynthia felt her heart slam against her ribs. She began to read the dense legal text, her eyes darting frantically across the pages. The document laid out a detailed timeline of events that completely shattered her final remaining delusion. It detailed the exact whereabouts of Neil, the lead contractor she had been sleeping with. Neil had not escaped to a tropical offshore sanctuary with the millions of dollars he embezzled from the Avalon Complex concrete budget. He had driven south in a rented vehicle attempting to cross the southern border into Mexico. But the moment the Department of Building and Safety condemned the downtown site, federal authorities immediately flagged his passport and his financial records. Border Patrol agents pulled him out of the line at the crossing. They searched his vehicle and found 3 large duffel bags packed with undeclared cash and corporate ledgers. He was arrested on the spot and transported to a federal holding facility. Neil was a charming grifter, but he was also an absolute coward. When the federal prosecutors sat him down in an interrogation room and explained that he was facing decades in a maximum security penitentiary for grand larceny and structural sabotage, he completely folded. He did not try to protect Cynthia. He did not honor their romantic affair. He immediately begged for a plea deal to save his own skin. To secure that deal, he had to offer the prosecutors a bigger target. He handed them his encrypted laptop and gave them the passwords to his private communication servers. Cynthia read the second page of the subpoena, and the remaining color completely drained from her face. The district attorney had printed exact transcripts of the emails she had sent to Neil over the past 6 months. She had used her private account, thinking she was completely untraceable. She read her own arrogant words printed in stark black ink on the federal document. The prosecutors had absolute written proof that she knew the concrete being poured for the Avalon Complex was dangerously substandard. Neil had sent her an email warning her that the diluted river sand mixture might not pass a deep-core municipal inspection. Cynthia had replied with a direct written order. She explicitly instructed him to proceed with the cheap materials anyway. The subpoena quoted her exact reasoning. She had written that they needed to drastically cut the construction costs to artificially inflate the corporate valuation of Vanguard properties on paper. She stated clearly that she was preparing to demand a divorce, and she needed the company to look incredibly profitable so she could seize the maximum amount of wealth during the settlement. She had knowingly and deliberately ordered the sabotage of a massive commercial skyscraper, completely endangering thousands of innocent lives, just so she could steal my life's work. The documents trembled in her hands as the icy wind whipped around the concrete bus stop. The federal prosecutors did not just have a theory. They had a signed confession from the lead contractor and an unbroken digital trail of premeditated corporate fraud leading directly to her private inbox. The subpoena was not asking her to appear for a simple deposition. It was a formal notification that she was the primary target of an active federal criminal investigation. She was being summoned to surrender her passport and appear before a grand jury to answer for her role in a multi-million-dollar embezzlement and public endangerment conspiracy. The absolute crushing reality of the situation pinned her to the bench. For the past week, she had been fighting a desperate losing battle against civil bankruptcy. She had been terrified of losing the massive estate, the luxury cars, and the social status she craved. She thought being completely broke was the worst thing that could possibly happen to her. She was entirely wrong. The civil bankruptcy was just the opening act. By demanding complete indemnified ownership of Vanguard properties, she had not only assumed the massive municipal debt, but she had also legally claimed total responsibility for the criminal actions executed under the corporate umbrella. She could no longer blame me for the failed oversight. She could no longer claim ignorance. The divorce settlement she had forced me to sign was the ultimate piece of evidence proving she demanded total control over the fraudulent operation. The civil financial collapse she had been desperately trying to navigate had just violently mutated into a massive criminal fraud investigation. She was no longer facing eviction from a mansion. She was facing decades behind the steel bars of a federal prison, and she had absolutely no money left to hire a lawyer to save her. The legal machinery of a federal foreclosure does not operate with sympathy. It operates with absolute surgical precision. By Thursday morning, the bank had officially executed the seizure of the primary estate. Cynthia had ignored the bright yellow notice taped to the front door, hoping the federal prosecutors or her former attorney would somehow miraculously intervene and save her. But absolutely no one intervened. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, 2 county sheriff's deputies parked their marked cruisers at the bottom of the long brick driveway. They were accompanied by a representative from the municipal bank carrying a heavy clipboard and a ring of brass master keys. They did not knock politely. They pounded on the heavy mahogany doors until Cynthia finally dragged herself off the cold velvet sofa and opened them. She looked exhausted, terrified, and completely disheveled. The bank representative handed her a formal eviction mandate printed on heavy legal paper. He explained in a completely flat, monotone voice that the residential property was now legally owned by the municipal creditors. He told her she had exactly 24 hours to gather her personal belongings and entirely vacate the premises. If she was still inside the house by 8 o'clock the following morning, she would be arrested by the deputies for criminal trespassing. The brutal reality of her situation finally shattered her last remaining arrogant delusion. She was not going to negotiate her way out of this disaster. She was being physically thrown out onto the street. The sheriff's deputies stood in the grand foyer watching her with cold, professional detachment as she stumbled backward, clutching the eviction notice. They informed her they would be conducting a preliminary inventory walkthrough of the entire estate to ensure she did not attempt to steal or damage any of the expensive fixtures or built-in appliances before she left. She was strictly forbidden from removing anything that belonged to the estate itself. She could only take her own clothing and basic personal hygiene items. Cynthia retreated up the sweeping curved staircase to the master bedroom. The massive house was still completely without power or heat, making the air inside feel like a damp cavern. She walked into the expansive walk-in closet and pulled down her luggage from the high shelves. They were incredibly expensive designer suitcases crafted from imported Italian leather. They were the exact same suitcases she had proudly packed just a few months ago when she took secret weekend trips to luxury resorts with Neil. She had used my corporate funds to buy that luggage and pay for the romantic getaways with the man who would eventually destroy her entire life. Now she was using those same expensive bags to pack her remaining clothes for a humiliating eviction she brought entirely upon herself. She opened the suitcases on the cold hardwood floor and began frantically throwing her designer dresses, silk blouses, and cashmere sweaters inside. She packed her expensive high-heeled shoes and her remaining jewelry that the tow truck driver had refused to accept. She realized very quickly that a woman cannot pack a 12,000-square-foot mansion into 4 leather suitcases. She had to leave behind the antique wooden furniture, the massive expensive art collection, and the imported silk rugs she had spent years carefully curating. Those beautiful items were now the sole property of the bank, meant to be liquidated at a public county auction to satisfy a fraction of her massive municipal debt. As she packed, she tried desperately to find a lifeline. She dug her mobile phone out of her leather purse. She had managed to charge the battery slightly using a cheap portable power bank she found buried in a kitchen drawer. She scrolled through her extensive contact list. Her phone was full of names belonging to the elite wealthy socialites of the city. These were the women she played tennis with at the exclusive country club, the women she hosted for lavish catered brunches in this very house. She dialed the first number. It rang 4 times and went straight to a generic automated voicemail. She dialed a second number. It went immediately to voicemail without ringing. She spent an entire agonizing hour sitting on the cold floor of the dark closet, calling every single person she considered a close friend. Nobody answered the phone. The elite social circles of the city operate on a strict, unforgiving currency of wealth and reputation. The moment Vanguard Properties was slapped with a massive federal emergency lien, the vicious rumors began to spread through the country club. When the district attorney issued the federal grand jury subpoena for criminal fraud, her name became absolutely radioactive. Her wealthy friends did not just abandon her, they completely erased her from their perfect lives. They knew she was entirely bankrupt, and they knew she was facing decades in federal prison. Nobody wanted to be associated with a sinking criminal ship. They ignored her desperate phone calls and permanently blocked her number. Cynthia sat alone in the dark, freezing closet holding her dead phone, realizing she had spent 30 years buying the fake loyalty of people who evaporated the second her bank accounts were frozen. By late afternoon, the physical toll of packing began to completely break her spirit. She had filled 4 massive leather suitcases to the point where the metal zippers barely closed. She dragged them out of the master suite one by one. The house was dead quiet, except for the sound of the heavy rubber wheels rolling across the hardwood floors. She managed to get the heavy bags to the top of the grand staircase. The residential elevator was completely dead because the municipal power was cut. She had to physically carry each heavy suitcase down the long curved stairs by herself. She was completely exhausted, her muscles aching, and her soft hands blistered from the heavy leather straps. She dropped one of the bags halfway down the staircase. It tumbled violently down the carpeted steps, bursting open at the bottom and spilling her expensive silk dresses across the dusty marble floor of the grand foyer. She sat down on the cold stairs and cried a bitter, hollow cry. She slowly crawled down the rest of the steps, gathered her spilled clothes from the dirty floor, and shoved them back into the broken suitcase. The winter sun began to set, casting long, dark, terrifying shadows across the empty estate. She knew she could not spend another freezing, miserable night in the dark house. She managed to drag the 4 heavy suitcases out the front door and onto the brick driveway. She left the heavy mahogany door wide open behind her, a fitting symbol of her complete, absolute surrender. The bank would come to change the locks in the morning anyway. She gripped the leather handles of her bags and began the agonizing physical process of hauling them down the long, winding driveway toward the main public street. Her expensive leather shoes slipped on the wet, freezing pavement. She dragged 2 bags forward, walked back up the driveway, and dragged the other 2 bags to meet them. It took her almost a full hour to reach the end of the property line. She stood on the wet concrete curb, shivering violently in the cold evening wind. She had managed to scrape together $40 in crumpled bills from the pockets of her winter coats. It was barely enough to pay for a cheap city taxi to take her to a discount roadside motel on the absolute edge of town. She stood under the flickering amber light of the street lamp, waiting for a cab she had called from a nearby gas station payphone earlier that afternoon. She looked back up the long, dark driveway at the massive, dark silhouette of the estate she had fought so ruthlessly to steal. It looked like a giant, empty, silent tomb. A pair of bright halogen headlights suddenly swept across the wet pavement of the street. A vehicle turned off the main road and pulled slowly up to the curb exactly where she was standing. Cynthia stepped forward, expecting to see the faded yellow paint of a cheap city taxicab. She reached down for the handle of her heaviest suitcase, ready to load it into the trunk and escape the freezing cold. But the vehicle did not have a taxi sign on the roof. It was a large, heavy-duty pickup truck. The powerful engine idled with a low, steady rumble cutting through the quiet night air. The truck was painted a dark metallic gray and featured very specific mechanical modifications. The heavy suspension was lowered on the driver's side, and a heavy motorized hydraulic wheelchair lift was mounted securely to the reinforced side doors. It was a highly specialized, incredibly expensive vehicle designed specifically for a driver with a severe spinal cord injury. The tinted driver's side window slowly rolled down. Cynthia stood completely frozen on the concrete curb, her cold hand still clutching the handle of her designer luggage. She stared into the warm, illuminated cabin of the truck. Sitting behind the steering wheel, completely calm and comfortably warm, was Aaron. He looked down at his mother standing shivering in the freezing mud, surrounded by her broken suitcases. The arrogant woman who had proudly declared she would never let her massive corporate wealth be drained by his medical needs was now entirely homeless and facing federal prison. and the disabled son she had so ruthlessly discarded to protect her money was the only person sitting in the warm driver's seat, looking back at her. The county municipal building was a bleak, depressing structure built entirely from heavy gray concrete and cheap glass. It was located on the far edge of the industrial district, completely removed from the wealthy neighborhoods and towering corporate skyscrapers of the city center. The public auction room was located in the cold basement. It smelled strongly of stale floor wax and old paper. The walls were painted a sickly institutional green, and the long rows of hard wooden benches were deeply uncomfortable. This was the absolute bottom of the financial food chain. This was the exact place where broken dreams and ruined empires were sold off for scrap metal to the highest bidder. Cynthia sat entirely alone in the very last row of the gloomy room. She had arrived 2 hours early because she had to take the public city bus, and she was terrified of missing the proceedings. She wore a faded, heavy winter coat and kept her head bowed down, staring at the scuffed linoleum floor. She was completely unrecognizable from the arrogant woman who had paraded through the family court in a pristine white designer suit just a few weeks ago. She was sitting in this miserable basement because she was clinging to one final, desperate sliver of hope. She knew the federal prosecutors were actively building a massive criminal fraud case against her. She knew she desperately needed a high-powered criminal defense attorney to keep her out of a federal penitentiary. The primary estate was her only remaining lifeline. Even though the bank had foreclosed on the property and physically evicted her, she knew the custom-built mansion was still incredibly valuable on the open market. Her logic was simple and deeply flawed. She prayed that a massive bidding war would erupt between wealthy real estate developers. She hoped the massive residential property would sell for millions of dollars at the public auction. She calculated that once the municipal bank took their share to cover the foreclosure fees and the unpaid taxes, there would be a massive surplus of cash left over. She desperately needed that surplus payout to pay her mounting criminal fines and hire a lawyer to save her freedom. She sat in the back row, shivering in the cold basement, praying for a high bid that would save her life. The room slowly filled with local property flippers, bargain hunters, and aggressive real estate investors. They wore cheap suits and carried thick binders full of county property records. They spoke in hushed, rapid tones, analyzing the distressed assets on the daily docket. At exactly 10 o'clock in the morning, the county auctioneer walked up to the heavy wooden podium at the front of the room. He was a tired-looking man with a flat, monotone voice. He tapped the microphone and immediately began reading the strict rules of the public auction. He explained that all sales were absolutely final, all properties were sold strictly as is, and all purchases required an immediate certified cash payment. The first few properties on the list were small abandoned residential homes and empty commercial lots. They sold quickly for very low prices. Cynthia watched the clock on the wall, her anxiety growing with every passing minute. Finally, the auctioneer cleared his throat and announced the premier property of the morning. He read the street address of the massive gated estate aloud. The room went completely silent. Every single investor in the basement knew exactly what that property was. They knew it was the residential crown jewel of the Vanguard Properties portfolio. But the auctioneer did not stop at reading the address. He was legally obligated to read the full county disclosure statement to the potential buyers. His monotone voice echoed through the basement as he listed the severe legal encumbrances attached to the mansion. He stated that the property was heavily entangled in an active federal emergency lien. He mentioned the massive corporate default and the looming shadow of the district attorney criminal fraud investigation. The house was no longer a pristine luxury asset. It was a radioactive crime scene. The investors in the room slowly closed their heavy binders. They crossed their arms and leaned back in the hard wooden pews. Nobody wanted to buy a property that might be tied up in federal litigation for the next decade. Nobody wanted to deal with a mansion that was actively being investigated for corporate embezzlement. The auctioneer looked out over the quiet crowd and announced the starting bid. It was an incredibly low number. It was a mere fraction of what I had originally paid just to install the custom marble floors in the grand foyer. Cynthia gasped audibly from the back row. She realized instantly that there was going to be no bidding war. There was going to be no massive surplus of cash. Her final desperate lifeline was completely evaporating right in front of her eyes. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the basement suddenly swung open. The loud squeak of the metal hinges echoed through the silent room. Every head turned to see who was arriving late to a federal county auction. I walked through the doorway wearing my simple gray Sunday suit. My attorney Warren walked right beside me carrying a sleek black leather briefcase. We did not look like aggressive real estate flippers. We looked completely calm and entirely deliberate. Cynthia stared at me from the back bench. Her eyes widened in absolute shock, and her jaw dropped slightly. She pushed herself back against the hard wooden pew as if she was trying to physically hide in the dark shadows of the room. I did not even glance in her direction. I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead. Warren and I walked slowly down the center aisle, our shoes clicking loudly against the scuffed linoleum. We walked past the rows of skeptical investors and took a seat in the very front row directly in front of the podium. The auctioneer cleared his throat again, clearly eager to move the difficult property off his docket. He looked out at the silent room and asked for an opening bid. He repeated the shockingly low starting number. He warned the crowd that if no one placed a bid, the property would be permanently absorbed by the municipal bank and stripped for basic materials. Warren opened his sleek black briefcase, resting it on his knees. He pulled out a thick, certified bank draft and handed it to me. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my registered, numbered bidding paddle. I raised the white plastic paddle high into the air. I did not wait for the auctioneer to acknowledge me. I spoke in a clear, loud voice that carried all the way to the back of the cold basement. I announced a single, uncontested cash bid matching the exact starting price the county had requested. I stated clearly for the official public record that the bid was being placed by Apex Restoration. A low murmur rippled through the rows of investors behind me. The smart ones recognized the corporate name immediately. They knew that Apex Restoration had just successfully purchased the $15 million condemned downtown debt from the city council. They understood the absolute brilliance of the legal maneuver. Apex Restoration already held the massive primary debt hanging over the entire Vanguard collapse. By stepping in to buy the residential estate, Apex was completely consolidating the assets. Anyone who dared to bid against me would instantly become a financial enemy of the largest senior creditor in the entire city. The investors kept their paddles firmly lowered. They completely backed down. The auctioneer looked around the room. He asked for a second bid. The silence was absolute. He raised his voice slightly and asked for a second bid again, warning the room that the property was about to be officially sold. From the back row, Cynthia let out a choked, pathetic sob. She tried to stand up to object, but her legs were completely shaking, and she had absolutely no legal standing in the room to stop a public county sale. She was just a bankrupt spectator watching her stolen empire be legally purchased by the man she had tried to destroy. The auctioneer called out a third and final time. Hearing no objections, he raised his heavy wooden gavel high into the air. He brought it down against the sounding block with a loud, sharp crack. He announced that the massive residential estate was officially sold to Apex Restoration for the exact opening bid. I stood up from the front row and walked directly to the podium. Warren handed the certified bank draft to the county clerk. Because I purchased the estate through a federal foreclosure auction using the entirely separate corporate entity of Apex Restoration, the legal mechanism was incredibly precise. The county transfer completely wiped the property clean of all previous liens, corporate debts, and unpaid municipal taxes. I was buying my own custom-built mansion back for absolute pennies on the dollar, and I was getting it back completely spotless. The clerk stamped the documents with a heavy red seal and handed me the fresh physical deed to the estate. I held the thick paper in my hand, feeling the incredible weight of the absolute victory. I turned around, slowly facing the rows of quiet investors. My eyes drifted to the very back of the gloomy room. Cynthia was still standing there, clutching her faded winter coat. She watched in total horrified silence as the county clerk handed me the clean legal deed to the home she had forced me out of just a few weeks ago. She realized I had not lost anything at all. I had simply used her own blinding greed to scrub my entire legacy clean while she drowned in the toxic waste left behind. 6 months passed before the federal criminal trial officially began. The United States District Courthouse was an imposing structure made of white granite and dark-tinted glass. It was a place designed to make anyone who entered feel incredibly small and entirely powerless. I walked through the heavy security checkpoints on the ground floor and took the elevator up to the 8th floor. I was not there as a witness. The federal prosecutors did not need my testimony to build their massive fraud case. They already had an absolute mountain of digital evidence and a signed confession from the lead contractor. I was simply a member of the general public attending an open trial. I walked into the massive quiet courtroom and took a seat in the back row of the wooden gallery. Cynthia was seated at the defense table. She was completely unrecognizable from the woman I had married. The stress of the past 6 months, living in cheap roadside motels and relying on public assistance, had aged her a decade. She wore a plain gray suit that did not fit her properly. Her hair was pulled back into a severe tight knot, and she kept her head down staring at her hands. She did not have the vicious, expensive attorney Fletcher sitting next to her. Instead, she was represented by an exhausted, overworked public defender who looked entirely disinterested in her case. She was completely alone, facing the absolute crushing weight of the federal justice system. She had no friends in the gallery to support her. Her entire elite social circle had completely erased her from their memories. The lead prosecutor was a sharp, relentless woman who did not waste a single moment. She stood before the judge and systematically dismantled the entire corporate illusion Cynthia had tried to build. She explained the mechanical timeline of the Vanguard Properties collapse with absolute precision. She detailed how the defendant had deliberately ordered the sabotage of the Avalon commercial complex to artificially inflate the company valuation during a hostile divorce settlement. The prosecutor painted a vivid picture of a woman so consumed by supreme arrogance and blinding greed that she was willing to risk the lives of thousands of innocent citizens just to secure her own personal wealth. The jury listened in absolute stunned silence as the prosecutor explained how the foundation of a massive skyscraper was intentionally compromised to save a few $1,000,000. The absolute turning point of the trial came when the prosecution introduced the audio evidence. They had recovered a series of deleted voicemails from the encrypted communication servers used by Neil, the lead contractor. The prosecutor pressed a button on her laptop, and the audio began to play through the courtroom speakers. The sound of Cynthia speaking filled the quiet room. Her recorded voice was dripping with entitlement and supreme confidence. The entire gallery listened as she explicitly told Neil to ignore the structural safety warnings. She told him to use the cheap, diluted river sand concrete because nobody would ever check the deep foundation pillars once the cement dried. She laughed on the recording, stating that the city inspectors were lazy and easily manipulated by a confident smile. The second voicemail played immediately after the first. It was even more damning. Neil had called her to express his own cowardly hesitation, fearing they would be caught by a random audit. Cynthia responded with vicious anger on the recording. She yelled at him, demanding he follow her orders immediately. She explicitly stated that she needed Vanguard Properties to look like a multi-million-dollar cash machine so she could lock me out of the assets permanently during the divorce finalization. She said she did not care if the foundation cracked in 5 years because they would have already cashed out and moved to an offshore island by then. The sheer callousness of her words echoed off the high ceiling of the courtroom. It was the undeniable sound of premeditated, reckless endangerment. The judge presiding over the case was a severe woman with a reputation for handing down absolute maximum sentences for white-collar crimes. I watched her face as the voicemails played. Her expression hardened into absolute disgust. The public defender sitting next to Cynthia simply rubbed his temples, knowing he had absolutely no defense against her own recorded voice. Cynthia stared blankly at the polished wooden table in front of her. She could not claim ignorance. She could not blame me for failing to manage the company. She could not blame the contractor for tricking her. The entire courtroom was listening to her orchestrate a massive public safety hazard purely out of spite and greed. She had literally recorded her own confession. The trial did not last long after the audio files were played. The evidence was simply too overwhelming for any defense to counter. When the time came for the final sentencing, the courtroom was incredibly still. The judge ordered Cynthia to stand. Cynthia slowly pushed her chair back and stood up on trembling legs. The judge looked down from the high wooden bench and delivered a blistering lecture. She stated that in her entire career she had rarely seen such a profound display of selfish negligence. She told Cynthia that her actions were not just a simple financial crime or a routine corporate embezzlement scheme. They were a deliberate, calculated assault on the safety of the public for the sole purpose of funding a luxurious lifestyle she did not earn. The judge handed down the final verdict. She did not sentence Cynthia to decades in federal prison, which caused a murmur of shock to ripple through the gallery. But the alternative punishment she delivered was a completely different kind of life sentence. The judge ordered a massive, heavy restitution mandate. Cynthia was legally bound to repay every single penny of the $15 million municipal cleanup cost. Her wages would be permanently garnished at the maximum legal limit. Any asset she ever acquired for the rest of her life would be immediately seized by the federal government. She would live in absolute perpetual poverty until the day she died, forced to hand over almost everything she earned to the city she tried to defraud. Furthermore, the judge sentenced her to 5 years of maximum security federal probation. She was strictly restricted from leaving the county limits. She had to report to a federal probation officer every single week. She was subjected to random unannounced searches of her residence and her financial records at any time of the day or night. But the final condition of the sentence was the ultimate destruction of her entire identity. The judge permanently stripped her of the ability to ever hold a corporate officer title, a board seat, or any managerial position ever again. The woman who had ruthlessly destroyed my life just to be the sole chief executive officer of a massive real estate empire was legally banned from ever stepping foot inside a corporate boardroom. She was entirely erased from the business world she worshipped. She could never rebuild. She could never regain her status. She was permanently branded a criminal liability. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down, finalizing the total destruction of her life. The sharp crack echoed through the room, signaling the end of the trial. The bailiff walked over to the defense table to begin processing the probation paperwork and securing her travel documents. Cynthia slowly turned her head and looked back toward the gallery. Her hollow, desperate eyes scanned the rows of wooden benches until they found me sitting in the very back. She looked at me, searching my face for any sign of pity, any trace of the man who used to provide her with a life of absolute comfort and luxury. I did not smile. I did not gloat over her downfall. I did not show a single ounce of emotion. I simply stood up, buttoned my gray suit jacket, turned my back to her, and walked down the center aisle. I pushed the heavy courtroom doors open and stepped out into the bright hallway. I left her entirely alone in the absolute crushing silence of her own consequences. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. If you stayed until the very end, please let me know by leaving a comment below. Tell me what you think about how this complicated situation was handled, and let me know which city you are tuning in from right now. Please remember to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you want to hear more stories about how true justice always finds a way to perfectly balance the scales. I truly appreciate your continued support, and I look forward to reading your thoughts in the comment section. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you in the next video.